All right, well, very pleasant good afternoon, everyone. Welcome here to our event, Jim Rubens for U.S. Senate event to talk about national security and veterans issues. Great to see the interest here in the room, and some familiar faces and some new faces to me as well. So we certainly are very happy to have you here. We're going to hear from a couple of speakers, and we certainly will be taking your questions towards the end of it as well. And we'll be talking about a wide range of issues that are very important to our nation and how they directly impact us here in New Hampshire. And I think one of those right away is when you talk about border security. I know that a couple years ago I was a broadcaster in this town doing a radio show from Washington, D.C., and we were talking about the border issues, and to see how the heroin crisis has impacted us today is a direct result of open borders with Mexico. I was just at a forum in Hooksett last night where I live, and we were talking about one of those opioid forums, what it's all about. And one of the complaints that I heard from the presenters, which were some of the EMTs and first responders, was government inaction on this. So I think many of us in the room are certainly aware of the problem. And Bob Casimiro is going to be our first speaker today. He's here from Bridgton, Maine, so I certainly thank him for making the trip. He's here to discuss border security based on his observations and experiences from 8 trips to our southern border with Mexico, the most recent in March of this year. And he was the first to go to the border in April 2005 as the first member of the Minuteman Project. To help bring attention to our insecure border with Mexico. And the Minuteman assisted the Border Patrol by observing and reporting on observed illegal activity. So Bob will have a couple of short videos to share with you and talk about his experiences on what he has seen. So Bob, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I welcome any opportunity to talk about what I've seen at the border. I should also mention I'm very familiar with all aspects of immigration. I got started with this as a result of 9/11, and I started investigating the issue of immigration, and I've been at it constantly for 14 and a half years. So, as he mentioned, I went to the border first in April 1st of 2005 and been back there 7 times. And so I've got some pictures to show you that were taken down there. Most of the time I go to Arizona, southwest Arizona, in an area that's about 75 miles southwest of Tucson, a place called Sassabee, which is has a population of 54, and it's right on the border. And across the border from there is Sassabee, Mexico. But anyway, I'll show some pictures to you, but let me give you a little background of what you're going to see. First, I'm going to show a video that lasts for 15 seconds, and I'll show it twice because you won't get it the first time. What you're going to see is a group of cartel mules carrying drugs into our country. Now, these photographs, this video was taken by a group that I go down there with called Arizona Border Recon. They place these motion sensitive cameras out in the desert, and they pick up anything that goes by. It could be cows or Border Patrol agents, or in this case it'll be drug cartel members. So I want to show that video first. See, the date is February 17th of this year. I'll show it again. It's actually 15 if you count them.
Those are drug mules, is that?
Yeah. I'll wait till it's finished. Now what they are carrying is either cocaine or heroin. And they carry marijuana. It's marijuana is less dense, so they can carry a higher pack. So when you see a pack like a foot higher than what those are, you know it's marijuana. But as I mentioned, this was taken in February this year by cameras placed out in the desert by this civilian group that stays down there and does this. When I started in 2005, of course, when I went down there, my biggest concern was the illegal aliens coming across. And in that year, they apprehended 1.2 million. But more and more, as I go down there more frequently and more recently, my bigger concern is the drugs. And I'm sure you're well aware that just in the past year in New England, we've been hit by this scourge of drug overdoses. And it's even hit my community of Bridgton, Maine, population 5,000 out in the western part, which is pretty remote. But it's, you know, it's gone through the whole of our society, and it's a terrible scourge. And the border is pretty much wide open. And unless we do something about it, I don't know where it's going to end. But anyway, now let me show you some slides too. I've got 6 pictures to show you. Okay. That's me. That's the back of my semi-bald head. But I'm looking up at the mountains, and this is in Arizona. And the way the drug cartels work, they put scouts on these mountains. They work for the drug cartels, and the purpose of the scouts is to tell the cartels back in Mexico when the coast is clear so that they can bring across the illegal aliens and the drugs. One of the days I was there on that mountaintop to the right, I actually saw a scout up there. He kind of very briefly moved over the top to the back side of that. Next slide, yeah. Well, I want to show this side. The guy on the left is a guy by the name of Tim Foley. He's the field director for this organization, Arizona Border Recon. He's a 82nd Airborne veteran, and he decided he had to go down there to do something about it. So he's a member of this group, and he lives down there, right on the border. And this is where I've been going the past, 3 years now. But I want to show this slide because the person to the right of you is a Border Patrol agent. I have a personal reason for showing that, because when we first went down to the border in 2005, the Border Patrol was told to stay away from us. These are a bunch of Yahoo vigilantes down there, wave their guns all over the place and do all sorts of harm. But the opposite is true. The relationship between people like Foley and Minutemen and the Border Patrol is very good and very cooperative. We're down there to help them do their job. Well, one day I was there, I was at an observation post. I took this picture, and you can see, well, let me just point it out. This is an individual standing right there, and this is the border. This is a rail fence of the border. So one morning we started hearing this guy saying, "Help us, help us." And this was an illegal alien. He came up to the fence, he wanted water. And he said they had been robbed 4 days earlier. And they've been wandering around the desert. Now they just wanted water, so they came up to the fence asking for water. And this is very frequent. The amount of violence on the border on both sides is pretty extreme. I'm sure you heard what Donald Trump said about the crime, criminal Mexicans and all that stuff. Well, he exaggerates stuff, and to quite an extent, but there's an awful lot of that going on the border. Women are raped. They have what they call RIP squads, RIP squads. And these are groups that go around the desert and they prey on the illegals, rob them and beat them up and that sort of stuff. So it's a pretty frequent occurrence. 2 years ago when I was down there, I was with another group called Arizona Border Defenders. This is a group of civilians who live in Tucson, and they also put cameras out in the desert. And one weekend I went out with them, and they went out to service the cameras, and we bumped into 4 illegal aliens. 2 of them dropped their packs and ran away. These other 2 stopped, and then so we brought them down from the mountain, called the Border Patrol. So right now we're waiting for the Border Patrol. So to give you some idea of who these people are, the guy in the foreground is a 19-year-old kid from Chiapas, which is the southernmost state in Mexico. And this is his first trip across the border. The older guy is 27 years old, and he was living in New York, and he had gone back to Mexico, and now he was hoping to make a return trip to New York. He worked, I think he said he worked in gardening or worked in the field or that sort of thing. One of the things I want you to note, you see the guy in the background, look at his 2 feet. On his left shoe, you'll see his shoe, you'll see a boot. And on the right, you'll see what they call it's a carpet-covered booty. They call them booties. Now, this is a huge game of cat and mouse down at the border. We do something to try to stop them, and they do have their countermeasures. So one of the things they do now is when the illegals come to the border to come across, they have to buy a knapsack, they have to buy a jug of water, which is made of black plastic, the idea being it won't reflect light, so it can't be seen. And they have to buy these booties so that they won't leave footprints as they go through the desert. See, that's one of the ways the Border Patrol can track illegal aliens, by looking at the footprints. So now they make them wear booties so that they don't leave any footprints. All right. All right, this is a still of a couple of mules bringing drug in this country. You see, this was more recent. That's March 8th of this year. Okay, the next one. Now, these are the same mules they're leaving. Now, you can see they have different backpacks on. So they've delivered their drugs, and now they're going back across the border. And
So it seemed to be full of what?
That's the last one.
well, they also take their cash back this way too. That's the way they get the money back. One of the ways. I'm sure there's all sorts of ways of doing that. So let me just make a final comment: is that the border essentially is wide open. The Obama administration and the Department of Homeland Security has given up any pretense of trying to secure the border. Recently, they had a guy by the name of Mr. Judd, who is head of the Border Patrol Union, and he testified to the United States Congress to the House Judiciary Committee. He had said that he had gone in and talked to the Deputy Director of Homeland Security, Alexander Mayorkas, I think his name is, and he was told that they're not going to hold illegal aliens anymore. The normal procedure is when they get an illegal alien, after they've scrutinized them and taken their fingerprints and checked to see if they have any criminal record, they give them an NTA, which is a notice to appear. In other words, it's a court date. Sometime in the future, they're going to have appear before an immigration judge to get their case adjudicated. And of course, it's generally a court date. There's such a backlog; it'd probably be 2 years before they have the court date. So the vast majority of them don't show up. But even they've done away with that now. So they said that they're not going to give them any NTAs anymore. The policy is catch and release. So you catch them, maybe you investigate them, see if they got any criminal background, and then you just let them go. So in effect, we have an open border. I mean, the Border Patrol agents are very frustrated, and the morale is low. And when I was down there again, I talked to an agent that I had talked to before, so he was able to be very frank about what he says. And the thing that really bothers them is this catch and release policy, which you can imagine. You pay to do a job, and you do a job as well as you can, and then suddenly somebody overturns it and negates what you've done. Okay, that will be the end of my remarks. I just want to mention one thing. There's some petitions over on the table. Are you familiar with the H-1B visas? These are the visas that allow foreign workers who have graduate degrees, who have bachelor's in the technical field, computer programmers and the like.
Okay.
Computer programmers and the like to come to the country, and they work for 3 years. They can be renewed for 3 years. Well, there's a bill that was filed in the United States Senate that would triple the number of these visas and quadruple them for under certain situations. And there were 13 this is a bad bill, of course. There were 13 co-sponsors of it, one of whom is Angus King, who is Maine's United States Senator. So we made up a petition, and we got something like 300 signatures now, asking him to remove his name as a co-sponsor of this bill. Also, Kelly Ayotte is a co-sponsor of the bill. So I made up a petition, I just changed the name, put Kelly Ayotte in there so you can sign that, and they can keep it here and do with it as they will. Of course, Marco Rubio is also a co-sponsor of the bill. So, anyway, any questions?
Yeah, we'll take questions afterwards. Thank you, Bob.
Right.
Thank you very much. Great pictures on that. And it's a story that sometimes you'll see on some media outlets, sometimes, most of the times, not. Talking about a whole bunch of issues, related, border security, of course, is critically important. Also the veterans issues, which a whole lot of reason why we're here today too, is military issues, veterans issues. What are our priorities as a country, and what are the debates that need to be had today on how we can get the best treatment for our veterans and for those who are serving in uniform today. James McConnell is a New Hampshire state representative from Cheshire County. He is someone who I know to be passionate about a whole number of issues, and he's very knowledgeable on all of them. But he is here today as a retired U.S. Army colonel and speak about his experiences and observations in veterans-related issues, and it is our pleasure to introduce him to you.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you, Brian. First thing I want to talk about is the invasion of Iraq and our Middle East policy. As Lieutenant General William Odom, along with a whole lot of the rest of us, tried to make clear 15 years ago, invading Iraq would and obviously has proven to be the greatest strategic blunder in the country's history. Not only we realized the dream of a Shia crescent by removing Saddam Hussein and handing Iraq to the Shias, but in addition we also destroyed, in effect, the Christian communities that had lived there quite happily for a number of years. We're doing the same with Assad in Syria. The Christians over there are anxious to have him stay in power. There are certain times when the United States had brains enough to know to leave well enough alone. The fact is that in Iraq, nothing positive resulted. We lost 4,500 GIs. We've got 35 to 40,000 wounded veterans. And I might also add that I was lieutenant of the paratroops in Vietnam, and we had a lot of wounded veterans. And when we had wounded veterans, many of them couldn't leave the battlefield. They died right there because our medical care wasn't such that we could bring them home. That's no longer the case to the same degree, and many of the veterans that come back from Iraq and Afghanistan are far more seriously wounded than they would have been able to come back from Vietnam for. So as a result, many of the veterans coming into the system now are in worse shape than many of us were when we came back from Vietnam. In any event, let me go back to Iraq. We threw away trillions of dollars, and we exposed ourselves as a blundering giant. There's nothing that we've done over there that hasn't been counterproductive in the past 15 years. One accomplishment of the incursion into Iraq is that George W. Bush secured his legacy as America's worst foreign policy president. Beating out Woodrow Wilson wasn't easy, but he managed it handily. The only silver lining in the whole thing is that Americans now understand that absent oil, there's nothing in the Middle East worth an American sprained ankle. Involving ourselves in a almost 1,400-year-old religious war is beyond idiotic. The Sunnis and the Shias have been fighting over Muhammad's succession since his death in 632. That's going to continue regardless of our desires. All of us want to see women treated decently in the Middle East, want to see education expanded in the Middle East, and all the rest of that stuff. Quite frankly, at the cost of GIs' lives, I don't think so. In any event, beyond all that, of course, we've lost plenty of our civil liberties as a result of this fool's errand. Now, the other point I want to make with respect to the Middle East is that we don't have a grand strategy over there. Right now, we are fighting Shias in Yemen. We're fighting Sunnis in Iraq. And in Syria, we're fighting Shias and Sunnis. We even have a Defense Department faction, a Pentagon-backed faction, that's fighting our CIA-backed faction. And you can't make this stuff up. But until we have a grand strategy in the Middle East, we're going to continue to do this nonsense, and just this way. Unfortunately, from the standpoint of those people who want us to have a permanent presence in the Middle East, the only grand strategy that you can formulate that doesn't get you laughed out of the room is we step back and let the Shias and the Sunnis go back to killing each other in their 1,400-year-old religious war. The risk that we face if we continue going the way we're going is that eventually one or both of those groups or some faction in those groups will determine that we've become part of their war and become a participant in their enemy, at which time they'll be blowing up every little girl's lemonade stand here in the United States. Now that's beyond idiotic. There are other things that I have a great deal of difficulty with. I mean, the fact that we have focused on the Middle East and almost nothing else. There's a great deal going on out in the world that we have to be conscious of. During the Cold War, the Russians determined, the Soviet Union at the time, that they couldn't match us aircraft carrier for aircraft carrier and devoted a great deal of attention to rockets and missiles. They've developed a system called the S-300 way back when, which is a very capable anti-aircraft system. They're now selling that to the Iranians. They're letting them have that, which greatly complicates the airspace over Iran. Not that I'm hoping that we'll go over it, but the fact is that they're adding to a lot of countries' defenses in ways that, should we ever need to go into those areas, are going to be difficult. They've also got something called the S-400, which was the follow-up system to the S-300. That's something they've deployed in Syria to protect themselves, and which they have in Russia at this point. Not the Soviet Union, I have to get over that. But in any event, the follow-on system, the S-500, will be fielded next year. And there is speculation, if you read the international press, that by the time we get the F-35 fielded, it'll be obsolete because of the S-500's capabilities. The money that we're throwing away in the Middle East really ought to be spent on our defenses. We have, allowed our Navy to be smaller than it ought to be, because even if you want to say, well, the ships should be smaller than they are and they shouldn't be as expensive as they are, I'd quarrel with some of that, but quantity has a quality all itself. We need to have a significant Navy. And I mean more than we've got. We've got challenges in the South China Sea and the entire Pacific region. And we can't adequately address them because of the fact that we're throwing money away in the Middle East. I also served as a colonel in the U.S. Army in Europe. I was assigned to the embassy in Budapest and responsible for the line of communication from Germany to the former Yugoslavia. One of my problems that I also see is that we continue to have 2 brigades defending Western Germany and 1 brigade in Italy. Now, I wouldn't quarrel so much with the idea that we have something in Poland, and I understand that's in the works. But the notion that we're going to have 2 brigades sitting there in Germany doing what I'd contend is absolutely nothing, when the Germans have reduced the number of Leopard 2 tanks that they have in their active army from 3,200 at the height of the Cold War to something on the order of 300 today, and ended their draft, just tells me that Donald Trump, like the House Armed Services Committee, by the way, in the 2013 National Defense Authorization Act, recognizes that we should be pulling our forces back from Europe when they're actually not accomplishing something. The 2013 National Defense Authorization Act required that we remove all of our forces from Europe. Now, I contend that our Navy and our Air Force should be around the world, but boots on the ground are expensive. And if they're not doing anything, join the Army, see Kansas. Long and the short of it is, there's a great deal that could be done along those lines, and I think that our fixation on the Middle East is not only counterproductive, but flat out stupid. It's costing us money in all kinds of ways that we shouldn't be spending. It's committing us to things that we shouldn't be doing. And it's getting us in trouble over there that if we continue this perpetual war, it's not going to accomplish anything. It's going to really bite us in the butt. Now, let me talk about veterans issues. At the end of January, Secretary of Veterans Affairs Bob McConnell indicated that we have 440,000 veterans in the appeals queue. I meet regularly with the director of the White River Junction Medical Center because I hold another position elsewhere I don't want to discuss because I can't really get into that here. But the fact is that for 6 months, I and the other people who were meeting with me wanted to talk about the appeals process. So we finally got that done. And it quickly became apparent that the bottleneck in the appeals process is the fact that to adjudicate all 440,000 of those appeals, not all of which are sitting on judges' desks now, we've got 63 judges to adjudicate. Now, is it any wonder that a veteran who is desperate for the VA's help on his appeal who can't crawl out of bed or whatever the case may be, takes a look at a letter that he gets from the VA that says we'll adjudicate your appeal in approximately 2.5 or 3 years, gets discouraged, and joins those 22 veterans a day that the VA will admit commit suicide. There's something desperately wrong with this system. We have some other stuff that I'm working on, but for the moment, that's the one that I've got the facts on, but that's enough. Now, since that issue's been raised, they've increased the number of judges to 75, depending on who you talk to, it might be 74, but the point is, that's still way inadequate. We need a lot more than that, otherwise we're going to continue to be telling veterans who are in desperate need of help that they're going to wait 2 to 3 years. That's completely unacceptable. We spend a gigantic amount of money in the veterans on the VA, and we ought to be able to use it better than we do. There is a perception in the veterans community, and it's hard to argue with, that many of these backlogs will be taken care of over time when the veterans curl their toes. Not much of an approach. We have to do better than that. With respect to our congressional delegation in December, I wrote all of our members of our 2 members of the Senate, our 2 members of the House, letters addressing the subject of the Veterans Benefit Appeals judges and the short numbers that we have there. I spoke to both Shaheen and Ayotte's offices, and they said, yes, we're aware of it. Answering the question of, well, what are you going to do about it, or what are you doing about it, stony silence. I remain unimpressed. On May 4th, I went to something called a mini-MAC, which we have periodically in the veterans community, with the director of the Manchester VA, the director of the appeals process out of Boston, the director of the appeals process, I think he was out of the East Coast, but maybe the Northeast. And we discussed this subject at length, and it turned into an exercise in finger pointing. Our delegation indicated, well, the VA really has the authority to do this. The VA pointed out that, no, we really don't. The long and the short of it is, I continue to bash them both because none of them seem to be doing the job. And I am very unimpressed. Quite frankly, my feeling on Senator Ayotte is that, like a coward in battle, she's there, but she doesn't count. Now, I'll add one other thing. This is an orange bracelet. Senate Bill S-91 is the act which would require that the VA establish a program to examine toxicity in the descendants of those who have been exposed to toxins. This is not just a problem with respect to Vietnam veterans and Agent Orange. It's also a problem with respect to many of those coming back from the Gulf. And Shaheen and Custer have signed on to this thing. I've got a House version of this as well. But Ayotte has not, and neither has Congressman Ginta. And I've been in touch with their offices about it. They're still not signing on. They don't go for that. The House version is House Resolution 17, House of Representatives 1769. But what else I can say about this except the fact that I find that they're continually crowing about how they're backing up veterans to be quite disgraceful, and they're doing much. And I can't help but believe that anybody in this room who was tasked to do something would, after 24 hours of studying the situation, have accomplished more than they've done in the time they've been in their offices. I'm just not impressed. Anyway, I'll be happy to answer questions later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jim, and goes to show you why it's important for you to be involved in your government and why it's important to select the right people for our positions of higher office. Now we get to the candidate who is running for that higher office, U.S. Senate, candidate Jim Rubens, someone who may be familiar to many of you. He served in the state Senate and has a long distinguished record of accomplishments, and such as establishing the state's first charter school law, victim restitution, SB 2 voting, and electricity competition. He ran for Senate in 2014, U.S. Senate, and made veterans issues a major part of his campaign platform, particularly in finding solutions to the VA scandal, which sadly today still has not been fixed. Many of the observations that he made about national security during that campaign still hold true today. And today's challenges need a new direction and vigorous public debate in the media. So let's all welcome Jim Rubens.
Thank
Thank you all for being here, particularly veterans. We understand how tough it is to get out in the middle of the day, those of you who work. And we made some trade-offs on this scheduling for this event, so thank you. Hey, Peter. So as Brian said, during my 2014 campaign, I had the opportunity to meet and talk personally with a very large number of vets who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was very compelling to me. One night after a town hall meeting that I was doing, a veteran who was pretty demoralized and missing a leg and on crutches asked me to come aside after the town hall, and he took me outside and he wanted to tell me some things. And we were outside the town hall in the dark, and he shared with me his experience with PTSD, which he was suffering, the fact that his family had abandoned him. And he told me about his patriotism, which was undiminished in any way. And what struck me silent is when he told me that he didn't understand why we were fighting those wars. And that experience, sharing that gentleman's pain, that veteran's pain, is what tipped the balance for me in running for this office in 2016. We need a choice in national security policy. We need a vigorous debate on the approaches taken, and the extremely narrow debate we're having right now does not account for the failures, the problems, and does not illuminate to the public sufficiently that there are choices in policy that can do better in many ways for Americans, do better for vets, do better for our soldiers, be better for taxpayers, enhance U.S. national security. All of these things are part of this debate. And I begin perhaps where Jim left off with our experiences since the end of the Cold War. We have fought in the United States. We have shifted away from a strategy of protecting Americans from existential threats. We've shifted to a strategy of what is charitably called nation-building wars. And we have failed and lost in a succession of these wars for many years, a long list of them. And I'll just talk about the ones that are beginning after 9/11. These are the ones that are recent, in fact, just the ones in this decade. We'll begin with Libya. We have Hillary Clinton crowing and cheering during one of the Democratic debates about what a great idea it was that we bombed Libya to take out Gaddafi. And she was warned, Hillary Clinton and the supporters of that action, and we know from a lengthy New York Times expose that President Obama was about 50-50 on whether doing it or not. Hillary tipped the balance. Our military leaders warned the folks advocating doing this in advance, warned them that this would lead to more chaos and the likelihood of a debilitating situation. And what happened there, what we now see in Libya, we see the dictator gone, and we see ISIS with one of its 8 beachheads around the world. And Kelly Ayotte, the person I'm running against in this primary, and for whom I want to provide voters a choice, was cheerleading, drumbeating for Hillary Clinton's failed war escapade in Libya. Another example would be in Syria. Again, our military leaders warned that if we were to be involved in Syria, engaged in the process of arming and training and funding so-called moderates, our military leaders warned us in advance that that action would result in the formation of something that looks like a caliphate. Amazingly, remarkably prescient warning by our military leaders. Hillary Clinton, the endless war, nation-building war people, and Kelly Ayotte drumbeating for this, go in there, and what we have now, we have a caliphate with ISIS running it, almost as predicted by the Pentagon, our military leaders. Now we learned this has just come to fruition in April. In April, we have boots on the ground, soldiers fighting. We have naval and air forces fighting alongside Saudi Arabia in Yemen. What's happened in Yemen? Against everything that we had hoped for, counterintuitively, AQAP, this is Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia, in that part of the world, AQAP has become stronger than it's ever been in its 20-year history as a result of our intervention alongside Saudi Arabia in a war against the Houthis in Yemen. So what we need to learn is this process of nation-building wars has not worked. It's not worked, and this is what we can learn from this. There is a great extent to which tribal relationships are immutable. These folks who live under tribal societies are not going to become at gunpoint or at the dropping of a bomb. They're not going to become people who will abandon their tribal relationships and live under a multi-ethnic rule of law society. We have learned this. We see this now. We know that American power needs to be exercised with prudence and restraint. And we know we need to refocus on activities that are focused on defending the United States of America. We need to use other powers that the United States have, aside from military powers, the economic powers, diplomatic powers, cultural powers. So what I'm proposing, we abandon, and this is a main contrast I have with Kelly Ayotte. Terminate this strategy of failed nation-building wars, Hillary Clinton and Kelly Ayotte, and shift to what I call a strategy of quarantine and strangulation. Now, we do know we have an enemy here. What does that mean? It means, first of all, cutting off the money flow to the people who are intent on doing harm to America and Europe. Cut off the money flow. How do you do that? You start by talking firmly with our so-called allies, which I'll include just some of them in this discussion: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. We now know that Saudi Arabia, it's very clear, Saudi Arabia, people involved in the government of the Saudi Arabia were funding, supporting many of, maybe even most of, the terrorists who flew aircraft into our buildings and killed almost 3,000 Americans. We know that Saudi Arabia is the world's leading funder of terror ideology worldwide. They fund madrasas, which have spread this variant, this horrible variant of Islam, charged with hatred of different cultures and civilizations. Saudi Arabia must be held to account here. Turkey leaves this open border with Syria. The son of Erdogan, the ruler of Turkey, facilitates the black market by which tens of millions of dollars per year is moved toward funding ISIS in that part of the world, Iraq, Syria. We need to tell Turkey in no uncertain terms, stop funding terror. So that's number one, strangulation. Quarantine means having borders in our country, and we've talked about borders here in this situation. Having this open border with Mexico, we now know, and this is very recent data, 80% in this catch and release program that you heard about, 80% of people coming across the border, we don't know how many, hundreds of thousands of people a year, 80% of them are caught, apprehended, and then simply released into the country. Okay? We don't know who's coming across the border. We do know that of those people coming across the border, several hundred people in New Hampshire who live here are dying every year, at least about 300 as a result of the opioids being shipped across the border from the Mexican drug war. Okay? Kelly Ayotte promised when she ran for election in 2010, and I worked for her, she promised not to vote for amnesty. She gets down there, drinks the Kool-Aid in Washington, and votes for the Gang of Eight, open borders, amnesty, drive down American wages, and make Americans less safe bill. Okay? This has got to end. We need a secure border. Second thing, instead of, and this is about the quarantine strategy. Second thing, defend the American homeland. Spying on Americans and abrogating the Fourth Amendment. First of all, it hasn't worked. This massive dragnet spying program run by our government, very expensive, has not worked. There are barely a single instance of an attack against Americans that have been identified and thwarted as a result of spying. What does work is, under the Second Amendment, an armed citizenry. What does work is people being aware in their communities, in their neighborhoods, of threats, perceived threats. So, for example, if you see bomb-making materials in your living room of your rental apartment, San Bernardino, report it to the authorities by all means. So we can defend our nation without these nation-building wars using these alternative strategies. Now, I sketch out much more of this on my website, jimrubens.com. Another thing that we need to change. We have the Pentagon budget has not been audited and has been unauditable for 25 years. In 1990, the Congress passed a law requiring all the agencies of the federal government to have auditable budgets. If you're a corporation, if you're a business, large and small, you want your budgets to be transparent, particularly if it's taxpayer money. You want these budgets to be transparent. Where's the money going? The Pentagon, the Department of Defense budget for 25 years has remained unauditable. this is a problem. A sharp point of disagreement that I have with Senator Ayotte is a problem in pork barrel spending in defense, particularly defense procurement. I'm going to give you a single example of this just to simplify it because it's endemic throughout the defense budget. What happens when we spend money, as Senator Ayotte did in her vote for $10.5 billion just a couple of weeks ago in the Armed Services Committee, $10.5 billion for the F-35. That takes money away from readiness, preparedness, deployments, maintenance. That takes money away from the things where there are not lobbyists infested in the hall handing out campaign money to get people elected, okay? Readiness does not have the kind of lobby support, campaign money support that Big Iron has. So I'm going to talk about the F-35 and this vote. Again, $10.5 million for the F-35. This aircraft, trillion, forgive me. Billion was the amount spent. What did I say?
You said million.
It's $10.5 billion was spent in that vote. Thank you. Sorry, trillion, billion. It adds up after a while. The projected lifespan cost of the F-35 is 1.4. I'll get this one right. Trillion dollars. This is the largest single defense program that we've had in the United States. This aircraft is a flagrant failure. Its primary purpose is to enrich lobbyists and enrich defense contractors. It will do nothing to defend America. Leaked. This is a leak that happened a few months ago. There were a succession of dogfights, 17 of them, between the F-35 and the F-16. The F-16 is a 30-year-old aircraft run by the United States of America. Each of the 17 dogfights, the F-35 lost. A simulated dogfight was run with a Chinese aircraft, a Chinese fighter. The F-35 lost. It can't fly, it can't turn, it's a single-engine plane, it's not suited to the battlefield. The helmet alone for the pilots, each individual pilot for an F-35 is fitted with a $600,000 customized helmet, okay? Cannot be used for another pilot, okay? You cannot fly the airplane, you can't land this airplane without this helmet. There are 30 million lines of software code in the F-35. 30 million lines of code which have to be customized before each deployment, before each battlefield engagement, okay? This is an aircraft, pure pork, and I differ sharply with Senator Ayotte in her vote for this military pork. Yes, indeed, there are lobbyists in the hallway outside these votes. Yes, indeed, there are campaign contributions aplenty. This money starves readiness, it starves deployments, and it starves things that we have promised to our veterans. This is a bad, bad deal. So, give me just 1 minute here. So, the last thing I want to talk about, and this is a big difference between myself and Senator Ayotte also. And I'm going to read a quote from Admiral Mullen. Mike Mullen is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Quote, "The single biggest threat to our national security is our debt," unquote. The single biggest threat to our national security is our debt. Why is that? Because we can look throughout history and we can see that nations that were once strong, once that nation's economy goes south, once that nation's government becomes indebted, its military strength declines along with that. A nation's military strength is proportional to its economic strength. It's proportional to the financial integrity, the fiscal responsibility of its government. Kelly Ayotte promised, just like her promise for amnesty, broke it. She promised to be a fiscal conservative when she ran for office in 2010, and I supported her on that and worked to help her get elected. She gets down there and, as I've said before, drinks the Washington Kool-Aid. In just the past 18 months, votes for $1.5 trillion in added debt loaded on America. 1.5, and this is not billion, not million, trillion. In just 18 months, bringing our debt load up to above $19 trillion now. It's unsustainable. It will weaken our national security. There's no question about it. That vote is an anti-national security vote. It's an anti-fiscal responsibility vote. So I differ with Senator Ayotte on a bunch of issues. We need secure borders. We need a strategy that replaces these Hillary Clinton's failed nation-building wars with a strategy that secures and protects American safety. We need a fiscally responsible strategy, and we need to We need a procurement strategy that replaces pork barrel-driven spending with readiness and things that focus on keeping America safe. These are sharp differences. We need a debate on these issues. The choice that we will have is coming up in September 13th here in New Hampshire when there's a primary. I'm providing this choice on a variety of issues. This may be the single most important issue. This is the single least covered issue by the media, the single least debated issue among the public, and perhaps, as I mentioned, the single most important issue facing us. So thank you folks for coming. I'd love to have your support. JimRubens.com.